Hello, Environmental Policy 1 students. Back to you for Lesson 3 on historical context. It's important that we situate this conversation in the narrative that we've established in the first couple of weeks, which is that we are pitching environmental policy into a context that has an institutional and a paradigmatic or an ideational the legacy associated with it, including the dominant economic paradigm of growth and constant growth, and a discussion of economic growth that had not adequately taken the environment into account. And there are implications for this in terms of how historically, good people have tried to advance environmental policy, but they've tried to advance it in a context that was quite difficult and continues to be quite difficult as we see the struggles between environment and economy manifest themselves up in through the recent period, where in the recent period there's more understanding of the concept of sustainable development and the need to integrate environment and economy. We shouldn't kid ourselves that there's still a lot of the historical legacy still in place out there as we try to promote environmental policy. Okay, so that's the context within which this lecture will be given to give you a feel as to, what's happened with environmental policy in the past in Canada, and what are some of the constraints that we encounter as we go forward. All right, so let's take a look at these ideas. Okay. The history of environmental policy in Canada can be understood through two dynamics. Okay, and when I'm talking about history, I'm talking about history since about the late 60s, early 70s through to the current period. All right, which when you write the history of the environmental policy, which I did some 20-some years ago, the history of environmental policy in Canada with Bruce Stern, called the Greening of Canada: Federal Institutions and Decisions. Here are some of our, some of the lessons we can draw from that, so that we understand the history of environmental policy, so we can better understand the implications of the path forward. And that's the purpose of this lesson. Okay. But, two dynamics can largely explain environmental policy to this point. A long series of power struggles among government organizations and interest groups to resolve what should be done about environmental problems and policy. This played out, as it does in all countries, through a battle shaped and constrained by dominant ideas, which we discussed in the first two terms, structures and processes in Canada. Structures being the institutions of government in Canada, and the processes mean, how we always did conduct business and how that has to change. And we discussed that in the first couple of weeks too, in terms of the institutional structures that have built up around the dominant paradigm of constant economic growth and GDP and these types of things. We discussed that in our recent Zoom call, how bringing in change needs to face ideas, needs to face dominant structures and institutions of government and of civil society, and the processes in which previous information was given to the people and decisions are made. All right. And then the second thing is the ever-changing and expanding nature of ecological problems, characterized by increasingly unpredictable scientific uncertainty and interdependence. And we'll talk about that in today's lesson as well. All right. Sorry if I've got a little bit of running eyes because of my allergies. I've got a ragweed allergy. Okay, so environmental policies in all countries faces these challenges to one degree or another. All right. Let's talk about interdepartmental struggles a little bit. As much as we like to wish that environmental policy can be developed and implemented as a matter of science and reason, all policy takes place in historical context, including the legacy of ideas, institutions, and processes, as we began to talk about in these first 3 weeks. For example, in Canada, the Department of Environment was constituted in 1971 by Pierre Trudeau, Liberal government, okay? Basically the father of the current Prime Minister. This was a substantial achievement, but it came with a lot of historical baggage. All right. The department was constituted of the Fisheries and Marine Service, the Weather Service, the Park Service, and the Environmental Protection Service, which dealt with pollution and regulatory matters related to pollution, albeit in a very fledgling way at the time. And you should know that when we did the book on greening of Canada and federal institutions and decisions, at that time we had interviewed virtually every previous deputy minister and every minister of the environment to that point that was still alive. And interestingly, one of the most senior informative people up there passed away 2 weeks after I interviewed him in Vancouver. So there was a lot of historical data that was gathered for this project. All right. So each of these services had different mandates and histories and competed vigorously for scarce resources inside DOE. So you can imagine a situation where it's a fledgling environment department. It's not going to have a lot of resources initially because of the nature of the where the environment was and the power structures of government at the time. And then what we had a situation where there was limited resources. We brought all of these agencies together, and now the agencies within the new Department of the Environment, as it was called at the time, DOE, began to compete for their own internal resources. All right, and so that we didn't have a coherent army, so to speak, of environment people to pursue these interests. Okay, so. That put the department at a considerable disadvantage, because not only was the department fighting the dominant paradigm of the day, but it was also fighting itself. And so it took a long time to work that out in the system to move forward. And that can still be a problem, although our Department of the Environment is much more coherent today than it ever was back in the day, okay? Each of these services also had different mandates and histories, and they competed vigorously all the time. The struggles within DOE itself also had implications for external to the department, all right? So now let's look at, so you can imagine a scenario, right? I mean, economic departments that had always kind of had their way with what was going on in government suddenly had this new game on town called the Department of the Environment, which traditional old school economic development departments in natural resources and industry and so on had always conducted their business largely within that paradigm of constant economic growth. They were measured that way. And this is just not theoretical, right? These people were all measured that way. Their job descriptions captured these notions. Their culture, their institutional makeup, all captured these notions, okay, of constant economic growth, good. Anything that stopped constant economic growth, bad. All right. So the new DOE resided within a government bureaucracy that had strong economic departments such as energy, mines and resources at the time, industry, transportation. And as DOE tried to advance the environmental policy objective, those efforts by necessity came up against the predominant mandates and stakeholder interests of these departments. And these departments had at their disposal the dominant paradigm of society, which is economic growth is good. The environment is something we have to marginally take care of, but it was certainly not central in any way to their mandates, all right? As opposed to them having environment mandates today, which they do. All of these departments do, okay? So to the extent that DOE was internally divided, which it was in the early days, it was weakened in the struggles with other government departments at the federal level. So it was battling the dominant paradigm, it was dominant institutional structures, it was battling dominant processes, of which they were now seen to be a junior player, a newcomer to the game. Sit over there, young man, and keep quiet, right? That was the modus operandi, okay? The economic departments also had a long history and relationships with central agencies like Finance Canada and Treasury Board, two power centers of government, along with the PCO and the PMO, right? And international affairs. This gave the economic departments a substantial leg up in struggles with the environment mandate, not to mention the predominant bias for economic development overall, as I've said. So then you compound that with the fact that we also had, so we had the internal dynamic of DOD, they had the internal dynamic of various government departments at the federal level, but let us not forget the central dynamic of the federal-provincial relationship and intergovernmental struggles. Because the Canadian Constitution in its original form from 1867 North America Act did not mention the environment at all, this created fertile ground for intergovernmental conflict within our federal system of government, obviously, right? However, one should not blame all intergovernmental environmental policy struggles on constitutional deficiencies, because conflict around economic interests would have played out in competition with environmental policies in any case because of the dominant economic paradigm. But the opaque constitutional powers over the environment made for fertile ground for struggles. The federal government, of course, claimed its jurisdiction where it could, jurisdiction over the environment, where it could, based on indirect constitutional powers to make laws for peace, order, and good government of Canada, trade and commerce, criminal law, fisheries, navigation and shipping, and signing of treaties. Okay, so the federal government, because the environment wasn't mentioned in the Constitution, all levels of government were looking for other powers that were assigned to them in the Constitution to define their environment role, right? So fisheries, it allowed the development of, for example, the development of the Fisheries Act, basically preventing the dumping of any deleterious substances into waterways frequented by fish. That became a very powerful instrument. But it was an indirect way of getting at the environment, right? Criminal law, same thing. There were various things. Trade and commerce allowed to restrict dangerous products at the border, and all of these things were used as angles to get at various aspects of the environment mandate. On the other hand, the provinces exercised their powers. They used them to constrain federal intervention based on their constitutional powers for natural resources, civil law, property and civil rights, and all matters of local concern. So as you can see, the room for conflict by leveraging other powers into the environment mandate created ample ground for conflict, and the interpretation of these constitutional powers became a significant issue for the Supreme Court. Okay? But, we shouldn't just all blame it on ideational and institutional and constitutional matters. There's another unique aspect to Canada that explains a lot of environmental conflict as well, and that is the quite divergent geophysical properties and economic profiles of each of our provinces, right? I mean, Ontario is not at all like Alberta in terms of how it generates its economic wealth and its geophysical properties. The same could be said between Ontario and Quebec and Newfoundland, or Nova Scotia and Saskatchewan, or whatever, right? If you look at the economic profiles and the geophysical properties of these provinces, they're quite different. And so when you're trying to bring in national environmental policy, that creates unique challenges for any agency. So Canada is a huge country from coast to coast to coast. We all heard that when we were in high school, right? Or even in primary school. But the reality is within those parameters is a great deal of diversity in terms of geophysical properties and economic activity. Okay, and cultural as well when you roll Quebec into that. Okay. For example, action on oil and gas led to substantial conflict with the economic interests of Alberta and Saskatchewan. Okay, action on forestry came into conflict with British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec. Action on fisheries brought conflict with British Columbia, Newfoundland, and Prince Edward Island, and Nova Scotia. And action on industrial pollution brought significant conflict with Ontario, Quebec, and Nova Scotia, which is the industrial heartland of the country. So these struggles emerged not only because of division of powers, but also the spatial and biophysical properties of the environmental problems that we encounter as we encountered them. And we'll discuss more of that as we go through this lesson. So at the same time that this is happening, the Department of the Environment is formed in the early 70s. And so whenever you form a major federal government department, and that department now has a mandate to do something to protect the environment, you're going to get interest groups coalescing around this issue, okay? So in addition to the struggles at the level of government, long-standing emerging environmental problems also stimulated activism of interest groups around economic and environmental interests. Industry groups seeing the formation of the environment, seeing the rise of the importance of the environment issue, obviously began to more forcefully promote their economic interests relative to environmental challenges. Okay, resistance became more severe because change was imminent. Okay, and we discussed this in our last Zoom call. The economic line departments at the federal level had long-standing relationships with these corporate interests and lobbied internal to government on their behalf. There were alliances, right? The industry groups also took advantage of, as they still do, ambiguity regarding the constitutional division of powers between federal and provincial governments. So they started to lever the provinces against the federal government, and if necessary, vice versa. whatever was in their economic interest at the time, okay? This was especially the case when the economic profile of a province depended heavily on certain economic sectors, such as forestry in British Columbia, chemicals in Ontario, autos in Ontario, fisheries in the eastern provinces, etc. Okay, so strong alliances with these economic sectors and their provinces, what they deemed to be their representative governments, to face the federal government over what they considered to be intrusion into provincial mandates to protect the environment. And we still see this today, right? We just saw court challenges against the carbon tax, the federal carbon tax, led by Alberta, Saskatchewan, right, and Ontario as well. So these trends continue to the day, all right? At the same time, however, environmental groups began to emerge as well. And they began to counter the one-sided story being presented by economic interests in some provinces, okay? And federal government departments who had alliances with those industrial sectors, okay? So they began to emerge, things like Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, Pollution Probe, and so forth, began to become significant groups. Worldwide, the Canadian Wildlife Federation, and the bigger ones, began to, and they were substantially resourced. They were significant organizations. They were not, just two people sitting in their basement screaming at the government. They were well organized and reasonably well funded organizations. These groups simultaneously supported government action on the environment, and environment officials within Environment Canada, having been talking to many of them of the age, they actively promoted these, and they actively tried to engage these environmental groups to support their activities within government, because they were faced against such stringent opposition. So environmental groups became a very strong positive, as they are today. If you want to bring about environmental change, you have to mobilize the public constituency. These environmental groups were the early days of mobilizing public constituency to support action on the environment. Whereas today, if you poll Canadians, there are lots of them that will rank environment highest. Back in the day, those were the early days of acclimatizing, making the public more aware of the environmental challenges. So you can imagine the value that environment officials in government play, and at the provincial environment officials too, right? I mean, they're also having their own struggle at the provincial level. So these, environment officials federally and provincially and municipally, and for some of the larger municipalities, were happy to see these environment groups, because it gave them a little bit of wind in their sails as well, okay? But, environmental groups are a two-edged sword, right? Environmental groups want lots of action. Federal officials need to struggle with the current reality, and might only be able to get half that, or even a third of that, or even 25% of that. So environmental groups became advocates, became wind in their sails, but also became critics of environment officials when they were not able to push far enough, okay? And at the same time, industry and environmental groups became increasingly adept at using the media for their purposes. So you began to see media people talking more and more about the environment, both pro and con, right? You had industry groups in there writing opinion pieces in major newspapers, or being interviewed on television saying, hey, this environment stuff, what is this? This is going to create problems to create economic growth, economic wealth, to support our social programs, all this kind of stuff. And NGOs would get on there and say, look, we're losing species, we're this damage in water, we have mercury contamination of our fish, our Inuit people can't eat their fish. And so all of these things, began to play out now all of a sudden publicly, as well as the conflict occurring within governments and between levels of government. And this was a key part of the transition that was taking place from about the early 1970s to about the end of the 1980s. And then in the 1990s, we suffered a bit of a lull. But when climate change became stronger and stronger from about the 2000s to today, we're seeing a much more greater public awareness of environmental problems, because the environmental problems have become global in nature, and they become catastrophic in nature. Okay, and we'll talk about that a bit more in a few minutes. Okay. So then also we had international relations, don't forget, right? Because as environmental problems began to change, international environmental relations became more and more significant. And that began to happen from about the early 80s to today, right? When we first, developed the Basel Convention because of the transboundary movement of hazardous wastes. We began to develop the Montreal Protocol for protection of the ozone layer. We began to develop the Stockholm Convention on persistent organic pollutants. We began to develop all these different types of international agreements because there was only one way to address these problems that were impacting Canada, and that was because the source was not Canadian, we had to work internationally, right? And so that also became a completely new dynamic, and that dynamic is still very prominent today around climate change, around everything from genetic engineering to biotech to chemicals to endocrine disruptors to climate change, you name it, biodiversity loss, endangered species, invasive species, you name it. Many of the major environmental problems of the day are problems that cannot be addressed by any one government alone, right? But in Canada, we already had a long history of developing environmental cooperation frameworks with the United States around such issues as acid rain, Great Lakes water quality, and so forth, right? But the transboundary problems just became more and more significant, right? And there's only one way to address these problems, is you have to engage in international relations, all right? And when I first started at Environment Canada in, that would have been a number of years ago, 27 years ago, when I was brought in from the University of Ottawa to the department, it became very, very clear that international relations and trade relations were becoming more and more problematic for the Environment Department and more prominent in what we had to do. That became very clear with our involvement in international multilateral environmental agreements, with attaching environmental obligations to trade agreements, with the trade side agreement, with the Canada-US trade agreement, then the Canada-US-Mexico trade agreement. All of these things began to, and now you can scarcely talk about environmental policy outside of an international context, okay? So, and at the same time, what we had was, we had a continual development of our science capacity to understand environmental problems. When the Department of Environment was formed in the early 1970s, one of the unique attributes of that department was its strong science capacity relative to other federal government departments. So it was a very strong scientific department, and it continues to be one of the scientific centers, albeit not nearly as prominently a scientific leader as it was, say, some 20-some years ago. So from about the 1970s to about the 1990s, Environment Canada was undoubtedly one of the global leaders on environmental science, okay? But, over time, in the struggles within federal government departments over budget, over efforts by other power centers to constrain the power of the Department of the Environment, science became more whittled down, okay? And that occurred a lot during the period of conservative governance early in this millennium, right? In the early period when a lot of the scientific capacity of the department was attacked, essentially. And I think for you, maybe not all of you understand the history of the initial advent of the Reform Party when it came to Ottawa, and then became the new Conservative Party, and then one under Prime Minister Harper. One of the agendas there was definitely to downplay the environmental capacities of the department, particularly with respect to science. And that's true of any economic forces. All economic forces attempt to undercut environmental policy by attacking the science and information dissemination capacities of the department. When Donald Trump got elected in his first mandate, what was one of the first things he did in his first 100 days was basically to gut the Environmental Protection Service down there, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agencies, a lot of its science capacities, and a lot of its mandate to publish scientific information on the environment. Whereas before, the EPA, along with the Canadian Environment Department, were leaders in environmental science. It's a scarce document you see now out of the EPA publishing science on the environment. The EPA was basically silenced on climate change, silenced on chemicals, silenced on oil and gas sector, silenced on a number of different areas, right? And because this is a common pattern, because one of the major strengths of environmental policy is to bring awareness to the people through scientific information and the people's trust in the expertise of scientists and the honesty of scientists. That's a threat to a political agenda that tries to slow down environmental progress, right? So that threat is attacked, okay? So science itself is a battleground of environmental policy. It always has been, and it likely always will be. All right, because new scientific discoveries are a change agent, right? And those who wish to restrict change will bring the science into disrepute, will attack its budgets, will attack its arguments, will come forward with false science or fake science to counteract trust in the real science and all the tactics that are used, right? These are the realities, gang. Just giving you the realities of what goes on when you're trying to bring about environmental policy change, okay? It's also important to understand that as this is all going on, we've got this constant change in the nature of environmental problems that we're encountering. Okay, there are various phases that environmental problem identification has gone through. In the early phases, okay, we had the local problems. And those were still largely prevalent in the late 60s and began to go into the early 70s. But as those problems began to become more national or regional in scope, that required a federal government department to see that broader picture beyond what the local could see, right? But initially, environmental policy emphasized local environmental problems. Those problems like solid waste, local water pollution, local air pollution. These things basically drove the early days of environmental policy, right? There was no environmental policy until the people began to realize, oh, geez, our river running through our village is like gross. Or the lake, man, well, how come we've got all these problems with our lakes? Or, why is that steel plant over there spewing this unbelievable amount of black smoke? And so local communities began to mobilize, right, to sort of deal with these problems, right, in the first phase. And those were the early days of beginning to come to grips with environment, right, and increasing public awareness of environment at a local level. But then a second phase came around, and people realized that these problems were no longer just local; they were now regional, or national, or even international, right? So we began to discover problems with chemical contaminants in the late 60s, right? With Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, pesticides and industrial pollution began to become more of a significant concern. And then we realized through science, again, that's why science is attacked. Science was beginning to tell us, wait a second, this problem is not local. These pollutants are coming from way up the river, or in the other province, or from the United States, or if they're coming from Canada into the United States, or whatever the case may be, right? And then we began to discover other problems that took on a much greater scale, like eutrophication of fresh body waters and water quality generally. We began to look at entire lakes that were dying off because of eutrophication. And these lakes could transbound boundaries, right? They were no longer something that a local administration could address. They needed to be addressed more broadly. And then we started to experience the big one for Canada in the early days, which was acid rain, killing off all of our lakes, right, and some of our smaller river systems, and began to be noticing air quality problems starting to emerge as we had more automobiles, more population, more centralization, more urbanization. So now these problems started to become sort of at least regional and regional transboundary in nature. So we had regional natural resource management problems. Great Lakes were dying off. Lake Erie almost died, right? I mean, the whole lake almost died. A huge lake almost died off, right? And we had other transboundary river problems between provinces and between Canada and the United States. So we, all of a sudden, whoa, wait a second here. And so people started talking about the fact that these problems now are bigger than can be addressed locally or by provincial governments or municipal governments or local community groups or whatever. These needed to be addressed on a national scale. So Environment Canada begins to be formed, okay, in the early 70s after, the time of Rachel Carson and new scientific discoveries and realizations, okay? Then, basically in the late 70s, early 80s, we began to enter what I call the third phase. It was a continuation of second phase problems because they were never completely addressed, although eventually we got on top of eutrophication and acid rain generally. But we still had other kinds of pressures on the Great Lakes through chemicals and so on, right? But now global problems were emerging, right? We had hazardous waste, including their transboundary movement, right? We had hazardous waste being exported from developed countries to developing countries, untreated, unsafely, buried in the ground, not pre-treated, causing significant environmental damage and public health problems. We had transboundary movement of toxic chemicals now, right? We had them not only in trade, but we had the migration of these through the grasshopper effect, through environmental media, right? We had toxic chemicals coming from Latin America, from Asia, from everything, Science again discovered that. Science is doing studies up north of our Inuit peoples and our wildlife up there, and they're finding chemicals that we don't even use in Canada. How in the heck? And then science begins to backtrack against these and finds out that, wait a second, man, these are transboundary moving chemicals. They're moving through precipitation. They're moving through, various mechanisms, okay? So, now we have a whole set of problems, serious problems now. We're talking about toxic, persistent, and bioaccumulative compounds, okay? Ending up in our environment that we don't even use. We have a huge toxic loading into the Great Lakes system, right? That isn't under control, but in any way under control, okay? And then the big one comes along, right? We discover we have ozone depletion, okay? We have a hole in the bloody ozone layer, all right? And so now, the whole equation begins to change. Now the environment becomes a global phenomenon, and it becomes an issue that can only be addressed by getting our own house in order much more seriously, and then engaging the international community with a consolidated position, Canadian position. And that began to break down some of the resistance to the environment, right? To environmental action, because how can an industry group stand there and say that they don't want to do anything about the ozone layer and people are going to get skin cancer, right? How can the industry sit there and say we don't want to do anything about toxic chemicals that can do harm to ecosystems and public health? How can, so the balance begins to change in the debate, right? The balance begins to change because the real reality of the scale of environmental problems becomes so clear that even though there's a lot of resistance still out there, the nature of that resistance has to surrender some action in the area of the environment to maintain credibility. But they're still resisting, all right? They're resisting the scale to which the change will occur, okay? And then we began to experience depletion of resources on a global commons basis. The Canadian cod fishery began to die off. Fisheries on European coasts began to die off. We were getting massive kill-offs of whales and dolphins and these kinds of things. And people started to mobilize around preventing these things, right? We had an increase in endangered species. Science was telling us that this was a problem, okay? So science was telling us a lot of problems, and suddenly people began to get a feel like the scale of this is way more than a lot of people realized. And we're still in that realization phase, right? Of where people are now appreciating the scale of the problems is huge. And so now the people are beginning to realize that this surrender everything to economic interests is no longer viable. But they're looking for leadership on policy as to what to do about it, right? The people are doing their job of becoming more aware. Governments are now trying to struggle to do their jobs of finding solutions, okay? Then finally, we have the fourth phase, the phase we're in now, right? They're a continuation of problems from previous phases, primarily phases 2 and 3, but a deepening of global challenges and challenges posed by new technologies locally, regionally, and globally. Climate change intensifies, right? Chemical intensification creates new problems at all levels. Now we have not just the traditional pesticides that were a problem, but now we have all kinds of new issues of endocrine disruptors, those chemicals that mimic human hormones. We have, nanoparticles. We have all of these other things, stuff that goes on these shirts, right? Nanotech that gets into our livers and our brains and our hearts. and we find them there now, right? I mean, they go on a t-shirt, these non-wrinkled shirts and stuff, but they end up ultimately in your livers and your kidneys and so on. Biotechnology, we now have genetic engineering as well as biotechnology, right? All creating threats. We have genetically modified organisms, genetically modified seeds, and so on. And then, because of the global trade that emerged from the 1970s to today, we also have an explosion of invasive species that travel on cargo ships and travel on airplanes and come from Asia, like the Asian carp and other things of stuff, right? And then we have natural resource depletion on a systemic scale. We have some countries that are suffering from the loss of fresh water and so on, right? Endangered species. The endangered species list grows almost every year, right? And loss of global biodiversity, local and global biodiversity. So these are the challenges. And so, it's a constant battle to stay in front of not only the ideational, structural, and process aspects, but the changing biophysical nature of the environmental problems we're facing also are constantly encountered. Okay, but one shouldn't become cynical and depressed about this, because this is the nature of where we are as a human species as we expand. So, but dealing with each of these things on a discrete level is a very difficult thing to do unless you can do a major ideational change, major paradigmatic change at a societal level among the citizenry. Okay, I'm a believer that a lot of these problems can be solved, but they can only be solved when there's enough momentum behind the solutions that are being proposed. Okay. So within each of these phases, environmental policy challenges are transformed, and in many cases made more complex. There's no question. The interests and struggles involved become more dynamic and more complex. Scientific complexity is a reality. I mean, we have problems like how do we even regulate nanoparticles? I mean, you talk to federal government officials saying we would love to have a regulatory infrastructure for these, but frankly, we don't understand them well enough, right? The private sector has ran ahead with these things, and we're now just trying to figure out that, well, does it need to be regulated? And if it needs to be regulated, how do you regulate it? I mean, how do you control it, right? Time available to act before irreversible damage becomes more significant. We don't have a lot of time to act on climate change, right? I mean, industry would tell you, oil and gas will continue to be used for 50 years. Well, sorry, we don't have 50 years, all right? I mean, and so urgency becomes, but this is all a two-edged sword, right? It's a sword that can cut us if we don't act, but it's also a sword that can just be enough to raise public awareness that, hey, something fundamental has to change here. Okay, we have to change something more fundamental than just clipping at the edges. Okay, the economic implications of action have become more complex, right? And we're seeing that in the climate change debate, where some people are seeing changing away from oil and gas as an economic modernization exercise, which I firmly believe. If we're going to maintain a prosperous Canada, we need to transform into the new technologies. Where on the other side, they're saying, the loss of oil and gas will be a disaster to Canada. It will be, so the struggles continue, all right? But policy instrument choice under all these new scenarios also become more complex because the problems have become more complex, right? So we don't need less people involved in environmental policy. We need more people. We don't need less awareness in the citizenry. We need more awareness, and we're moving. We're moving in that direction. If you look at the signs, we are moving in that direction. Are the challenges huge? Yes, they are. But are we changing the minds of the citizenry? Yes, the minds of the citizenry are being changed. But changed minds alone are not going to be adequate. Strong young people working on environmental policy are going to be absolutely essential. Okay? So on that, I'll conclude, and we'll see you next time. All right? Take care for now. Bye-bye.